Welcome to the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the City Bar.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another podcast hosted by the City Bar Presidential Task Force on Artificial Intelligence and Digital Technologies, which we will refer to as the Task Force. Today, I'm joined by two panelists who are also members of the Task Force. Both of them will introduce themselves immediately before we discuss issues related to President Trump's March 2026 Cyber Strategy for America, which I will refer to as the Cyber Strategy. My name is Jerome Walker, and I will moderate this podcast. By way of background, I am a co-chair of the task force. The Cyber Strategy itself is very short, 6 pages long, consisting of 6 policy pillars that cover 3 pages of the document. The 6 policy pillars are titled 1. Shape adversary behavior. 2. Promote common sense regulation. 3. Modernize and secure federal government networks. 4. Secure critical infrastructure. 5. Sustain superiority in critical and emerging technologies. And 6. Build talent and capacity. Since there are only 6 pillars, we will discuss each of them in the order in which they are listed in the cyber strategy. To help understand the cyber strategy, its implications, and the likely responses to the cyber strategy, I'm pleased to introduce 2 task force members with extensive knowledge and experience on a wide range of cybersecurity and data protection issues, and each of them has spent quite a bit of time addressing AI, privacy, cybersecurity, and data protection issues across industries. These task force members are thought leaders and represent stakeholders across the spectrum. So let's get started. Hello, Sabeena and Alex. Sabeena is a task force subcommittee on artificial intelligence and national security co-chair and head of legal and chief compliance officer Americas at ICBC Standard Bank Group. Alex is a task force subcommittee on privacy co-chair and a partner at McDermott Will Schulte. First, Sabeena, and then Alex, would you please briefly introduce yourselves and your practice areas?
Sure, Jerome, I'd be happy to start. So, as Jerome, you mentioned, I oversee the legal and compliance departments for the Americas for ICBC Standard Bank Group. And in my current role, I'm responsible for all things legal and regulatory oriented with a nexus to the Americas. Therefore, cyber, operational resilience, IT and tech risk, business continuity, third-party risk management all sit squarely within my remit. And I regularly advise senior management, incident response teams about how to navigate cyber intrusions and ransomware attacks, and also assist with coordinating responses with law enforcement, as well as trying to keep our regulators apprised, as well as third-party vendors with which we do business. In my current role, I occupied a very similar role at the Bank of China for about 10 years. And I've also worked on both the industry as well as the regulatory side of our industry. Previously worked at FINRA when it was NASD, as well as the New Jersey State of the Attorney General's Office and their Securities Fraud Prosecution Department. Other industry participants in which I've worked also involve E-Trade, BNY Mellon, and I'll turn it over to Alex.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you both. As Jerome said, I'm a partner at McDermott Will Schulte. My practice is focused in, broadly speaking, technology, regulatory defense, litigation, counseling. So that is a heavy dose of cyber security, preparedness, and incident response, and litigation, regulatory defense related to that. I was previously a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, where I focused on cybercrime and securities fraud, and then also spent about 17 years at Gibson Dunn, where I ran the privacy, cybersecurity, and consumer protection practice group. And my practice today focuses obviously a lot on those issues, including a lot for defense contractors, folks in the defense industry, financial institutions, and technology clients, a lot of whom are grappling with some of these issues and thinking about the risks of cybersecurity and the implications from the White House cybersecurity strategy.
You know, what's kind of interesting to me about the cyber strategy pillars in particular is that they don't appear to have any, or at least very many, action steps, or they're just not very clear. And they appear in many instances to be aspirational in many respects. So let's focus on them. But before we get to specifics, I'd like you guys to just tell me what's your take on the general scope of the cyber strategy, and just speak generally about your thinking before we drill down. And we can start with Sabeena and then go to Alex.
Sure. And before I forget and before I get in trouble by my employer, I have to say my views represent only my own and do not necessarily represent those of the ICBC group or any of its affiliates today or in the future or ever. So, yeah, I think you mentioned a really interesting observation. It's not a detailed implementation plan. I look at it more like a statement of direction, and there's even language at the preamble of it that does talk about the operational details to later follow on what they call follow-on policy vehicles. So, if I think about generally what then the six pillars, I know you outlined them at the beginning of your remarks, what they sort of cover. I view them as being able to be grouped into three categories. So, for example, pillar one is really about offensive call to action. Pillars two, three, and four are what I would call defensive, even potentially resilient calls to action. And then, finally, pillars five and six, and in particular six, I look at it more like future proofing. So, how can we build capacity in the United States that can withstand the test of time? So, that's sort of my broad level overview of how I view the pillars. And Alex, I'll turn it over to you to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I think those are all good and important points. I guess at a high level, Jerome, you noted it's a 6-page document. I would actually say it's a 4-page document because one page is the cover page and one page is an introductory page. That in and of itself, I think, is notable. And Sabeena touched on this. It is aspirational and there's really not a lot of detail. Now, to be clear, that's not unlike historical cybersecurity strategies, but this one is quite different, let me just say, right? So the cybersecurity strategy from the Biden White House was 39 pages. And yes, it didn't necessarily have a lot of detail. It had only 5 pillars in contrast to 6, but it had 39 pages in which it discussed all of that. And it was followed by implementation plans. One was about 60 pages, one was about 70 pages. Now, those followed in a period of months, 4 or 5 months, and then another 6 to 10 months after that. So a lot of this strategy, I think, leaves a lot of questions, right? We don't yet know whether there is going to be an implementation plan and whether it's going to have the requisite level of detail. And I would say, in addition, this document is notable in its stridency, in the language that's used, which is to say it is a little out of keeping with the historical cybersecurity infrastructure, particularly the federal government, which, to be frank, is really apolitical, right? It's not a political. Cybersecurity is about defending the nation in a technical kind of way, both federal assets and private assets. And really, it's not a political issue, nor should it be, in my view. And yet this document really does delve a bit into the political and invokes the president's name multiple times. Frankly, there's some vagueness and lack of clear writing. And so that just stands out. And the reason I think it stands out to me is cybersecurity is serious business. And you want a serious tone from the top about it. And I think this leaves a lot of questions to be answered, and maybe they will be answered. Maybe there will be a clear implementation plan, and maybe our discussion here is part of that understanding of the pillars. But I think it's important to sort of note that at the outset. And there is a sort of different direction in tone, and we'll talk about that in more detail when we get into the pillars. But I think it's important to sort of just note that difference in approach to start the framing.
Sabeena, you want to add to that, or you want me to go into the specific?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say one other thing. I think that Alex brought up some really good points and some good observations. And just to kind of look into a little more into the history of this and where we're at today, under Obama, similar, very different concept. So focusing a lot more on norms and international cooperation. Biden's strategy focused a lot more on resilience, regulation, and infrastructure security. And then here, under President Trump's strategy, we see a lot more of a focus, which we're going to get into, on economic security, supply chains, and adversary deterrence. So you can see the tonal difference already, just to underscore, as we jump into the pillars in a little more detail, some of the observations that Alex has made.
So I can't resist this, Alex, in light of what you and Sabeena was talking about. So one of the ways that I thought that they could have had symmetry is they could have started out with shaping adversarial behavior, which we'll talk about in a second, and ended with shaping allies' behavior, because those two things could actually get us where we want to be if we can get our adversaries to do what we want. And if we can get our allies to get on the same page with us, it becomes, in my mind, a more likely outcome that we can have a cyber strategy that works.
And I look, cyber, those of us who practice in the field know you cannot do cyber alone, right? A company can't do it alone. A state government can't do it alone. A federal government can't do it alone. A country can't do it alone. It needs international cooperation because by definition, it transits the wires and knows no political boundaries. And so the prior administrations were very focused on international cooperation. And frankly, I think that's key to success with respect to cybersecurity globally. This strategy, keeping with the America First principles of the administration, does not focus on international cooperation, and perhaps one could say undermines international cooperation. And I think, unfortunately, that does carry some risk that the really fantastic international cooperation efforts in the cybersecurity space, I mean, there is deep and long-standing, very close collaboration by the intelligence services and other apparatus of the various governments across borders that make a big difference in protecting cyberspace for everyone on the globe. I think that there's some risk that there is some undermining of it, or at least to say it's not stated as a priority, and that in and of itself is notable.
Yeah, no, and I'm sure we're going to get into it when we break down, for example, Pillar 1, but I was just going to say there is an honorable mention to relationships with allies. But Jerome, I know you wanted to spend some time going through the pillar, so I'll let you go through it, and I'm sure we're going to get to it at some point too.
Right. So what I'd like to do now is, in light of the strategy and how it's laid out, one of the issues that jumps out at me is, let's assume that we do have this strategy where we're going to shape adversarial behavior. I want to get into first, what does that mean? And then second, if we're going to do that, what are the practical steps or the practical challenges that we would have in doing that? And so, Alex, I started, I think, with Sabeena before, so I'm going to start with you now. Let's focus. So we're talking about how we as a country, because it's a cyber strategy for America, how do we shape adversarial behavior? So what are the steps we take to do that? And what are the practical challenges that we face in trying to do that?
And this is probably the most significant sort of shift in strategy, which is to be more assertive in offensive cybersecurity activities in contrast to defensive, right? And so just to draw a parallel to the Biden cybersecurity strategy, their first pillar was defend critical infrastructure. Still remains a very important pillar, although it's not necessarily set out with perhaps the same priority. The Trump focus and the shaping adversarial behavior is really about offensive capabilities. We sometimes talk about that as hacking back or other kinds of offensive kinetic activities. This is a very challenging area, and in part, it is challenging because corporate actors, right, technology companies and others, security companies, they do have capabilities of doing it, but there's a panoply of federal and state international laws that govern those activities and in fact can make them illegal. And so what the strategy doesn't speak to, and maybe the implementation plan will come, is how do you get around that? Is there a statutory safe harbor that provides companies a safe harbor to take offensive cybersecurity steps Are there defense contractors who are going to get retained for contracting operations, and in those contracts will get indemnified? The biggest issue, right? So the federal government certainly has both the capabilities and does offensive cybersecurity aspects. But what this strategy is about empowering private actors to take those offensive approaches, and that is what's going to shape adversarial behavior. And this is consistent with the Trump administration's view of, you punch hard and that's going to make people back down. And I'm not expressing judgment about that. That's the approach. But the challenge for private enterprises is, how do you do that legally? And so the how you do it, Jerome, sort of to your question, is companies think about their cybersecurity defensive perimeters and how they control the incoming to their networks. And that is the paramount way that someone protects, same way maybe you protect a factory with a fence around the perimeter and a guard at the front door, right? Same idea permeates for cybersecurity. But what the administration is focusing on is the unleashing the private sector to identify and disrupt adversary networks. So to reach out into cyberspace and try to disrupt adversarial networks. The real challenge with that is, how do you control it? How do you, and this is where the risk comes and this is where the liability comes, right? If someone attacks a network that they think is an adversary network, someone being a private actor, how do they know that's not a rogue actor who has embedded on some university system in a foreign country, and it's going to take down that university system's network, including the hospital at that university, right? You don't know. The challenge with particularly cyber offensive capabilities is it's very hard to understand the collateral consequences. There was a very famous early hacking incident where one of these early hackers played with a telephone switch remotely. I mean, this was like done through phones, like not cell phones, like phones. And it took down the network switch. And in fact, what that had was a connection to a local airport, and it knocked out the lights in the airport, right? That is the collateral consequence risk that comes from offensive cyber. No, that was a bad actor, but offensive cyber activity. And that is why private sector actors are very careful and cautious about this. And so the real test, I think, here is, what is the administration going to do to actually incentivize companies to feel confident to do that with minimal risk? Are they going to contract them to take certain steps and provide indemnifications? How is that going to work? Are they going to provide safe harbor statutorily? Those are really big questions. And I think, to be frank, we're not going to see much of this activity without that kind of clarity.
So, Sabeena, I want to modify it slightly, because you're in a unique position where you are in a major international company. And so, because you are in a major international company, you're in a lot of markets. So the concept of, quote, shaping adversarial behavior without knowing what adversarial means, for things to work, as Alex was suggesting, particularly in the private sector, particularly with multinational companies, international companies, you have to cooperate across borders, because there are governing laws in each of the countries in which you operate. So how do you overcome those practical implications when you're trying to shape adversarial behavior?
Yeah, I mean, part of what Alex mentioned is important as well, right? So I think what the strategy contemplates is partnerships, of course, with private sector, but it's also contemplating, I would call it partnerships. I know, Alex, you might disagree, with our allies, right? And the exact language that is used, I think they call them allies with similar democratic values, if I'm not mistaken. So there is a little bit of an understanding that the need to cooperate is essential to really thwarting off these adversaries who can wreak havoc on our US system and ultimately undermine our security. So having said that, as a global organization, we have to navigate a myriad of regulations. We have to also be accountable to a myriad of regulators. And oftentimes we have to seek out enterprise-wide solutions. So while there might be, just to give sort of a practical example of where some of these tensions exist, In other jurisdictions, they have been able, for national security purposes, been able to thwart, been able to actually establish private and public partnerships in ways that we can't, and we have not can't, I shouldn't say we have not been able to in the United States. Think about things like corporate digital identity. And from an AML perspective, AML is essential. We really need to understand who it is that we're transacting with, because if we don't, the financial systems can be left vulnerable, and you can have nefarious actors transacting on our rails, right? Our payment rails and other things. So what I've noticed, for example, is in Singapore, there are partnerships with private organizations and the government to actually allow organizations that operate in this space and that have obligations, for example, to KYC and conduct due diligence on their client base, they can actually access a national database where this digital sort of identity verification can be ported and basically be conducted on behalf by these third parties, and where we as financial institutions don't have to rinse and repeat it every single time we onboard a new customer. So we have seen that sort of be successful. Now, what makes it difficult in the United States when you think about things like the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, and that also codified the Corporate Transparency Act, FinCEN tinkered with the same idea. They wanted to create this beneficial ownership registry. So at the state level, and you do, by the way, see language under this first pillar, which does talk about the distribution and cost of responsibility must be fair across the U.S. and allies. So on some level, that reference to across the U.S. also implies coordination with the states. I don't know if Alex and Jerome, you'll disagree with me, but it's so broad, it's hard to imagine that it wouldn't. So when I think about things like the FinCEN beneficial ownership database, that involved partnerships with the states, that every single time any entity set up shop in the United States, states occasionally, depending on the state, will collect information about them. And to the extent that you have a corporate entity, whether it's foreign owned or domestic owned, now with this new CTA requirements put in place, they now have to disclose who their beneficial owners are. And FinCEN is supposed to be collecting it in a database that makes this database, upon consent of the customer, available to financial institutions who onboard them. The problem is that right now, if you have enterprise-wide onboarding procedures and controls, because you have a global client database, you cannot share that information with any of your affiliates. So I operate, for example, with London being our main sort of KYC onboarding hub, and we can't share that unfortunately, across borders. Having said that, there's been a lot of pushback on that particular database and the use of it in the United States. But there you can see an example of where that tension sort of lies in global organizations that have to navigate a myriad of regulations. I just gave you one example for AML. The same problems exist with respect to privacy, with respect to if you have a ransomware attack, how you report it. We have to navigate a whole patchwork of regulations that may not necessarily offer, I guess, the kind of information sharing that this first pillar would sort of envision. So that does provide a very practical challenge.
Alex, you started out when you first started talking about this, you identified some incentives. For example, given the private sector a safe harbor, that might be an incentive. Could you flesh it out more? Because the second question, which arises out of shaping adversarial behavior, it's that the pillar indicates that we're going to unleash the private sector by creating incentives for the private sector to identify, but not just identify, but identify and disrupt adversarial networks and scale our national capabilities. Could you flesh that out, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and frankly, to continue the sentence sort of helps to detail it: detect, confront, and defeat cyber adversaries before they breach our networks. So the idea here is find, and look, to be clear, we know, and by we, I don't mean me, the intelligence services know there are buildings in locations that they know are often in North Korea, Russia, a number of other locations that are set up with quasi-military intelligence operatives who are sending out offensive cyber attacks. They know where they are. And to be clear, they don't know where all they are, but they certainly know where they are. And so the government can do that, but that carries political risk. And by that, I mean, go after those. I mean, they could attack them militarily if there was such choice and political will and authorization, but that's a whole different conversation. But they could jam their signals, they could send malware into the networks, that kind of stuff. The idea of this pillar is we're going to unleash the private sector to do that. So the idea is the private sector would be able to identify these locations, and certain very sophisticated private sector actors do have intelligence on this, and to unleash them to defeat before they attack, right? So what that means is, for example, send malware into that building and disrupt all their computers so they can't attack out at us. Again, that is, as it stands, would be a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, right? It's 18 U.S.C. 1030 expressly prohibits that, makes it a criminal. So if I was advising a company about that, I would say you need some rock solid protection and indemnification and clarity from the federal government that you're not, in fact, violating the law by sending signals to a location to disrupt their systems. But that's what it means. And the idea here is by unleashing the private sector to do that, which has been leashed to the extent that they are compliant with law that does not allow this, which I would say generally is the case, it is left to the federal authorities, intelligence agencies, to do this kind of offensive capabilities. So the premise of this is by allowing more and private sector actors to have this effect, that will be disruptive. It will stop the adversaries from attacking us. And I think it theoretically could, and there's really two angles to it. You could actually retain a private sector actor to do it for the federal government, and that would be a contracting issue, and that would perhaps provide some protections. You would need to provide indemnification, and that actually runs into some federal contracting law problems under the Anti-Theft Deficiency Act, but that's a whole another conversation. But you could also just enable sort of tech companies or various cybersecurity actors to do it. There's one other challenge to this, because I've sort of painted this picture that we know where they are in sort of buildings. The frank reality is that the cyber attackers are a loosely knit bunch of usually fairly sophisticated engineers, and they are only loosely connected to military or intelligence operations or gangs or criminal operations and organizations. And so the idea that you would have sophisticated targeting and be able to find where they are and detect, confront, and defeat is not so easy to actually be done. And that is another wrinkle here, because the way that these offensive actors, they embed their systems in, as I said, university systems or some other network that's been compromised. They're using machines that other people are also using to run their adversarial operations from. And so by confronting them and defeating them, there is a very real risk of very substantial collateral consequences. And that is part of the challenge.
So let me move to the next pillar, which may, at least on paper, seems like it's easier to address. We'll see if that's true. And I'm going to direct this to you, Sabeena. It sounds easy to say promote common sense regulation. And that's what the title of that pillar is. So I guess, Sabeena, it starts out focusing on cyber defense, and it gets into some direct criticism of, quote, costly checklists that delays preparedness, action, and response. So could you flesh that out? This concept of promoting common sense regulation, and one way to do it, I guess the pillar is implying that you can reduce these, quote, costly checklists that delay preparedness, action, and response. And I wanted to focus on that because actually, whether it's NIST or it's the regulatory agencies, they have worksheets. Some of the worksheets include checklists. So I'm not exactly sure what the pillar is getting at here. Help us understand this pillar.
In my view, I think it piggybacks on your earlier question, which was you asked about regulated institutions and how they can navigate this space. And essentially, you didn't ask it directly how they can partner as well with the federal government, because oftentimes they're the front lines. They're the ones that can detect these issues. Going to this specific issue, I think it's an implicit recognition that that partnership with financial institutions, I'm going to look at it from a financial institution perspective, can exist. So in my view, this pillar is criticizing these compliance-only models, and we'll get to the NIST framework in a second. But the point is that organizations can become overly focused on and even invest very heavily, resource-wise, into documenting, performing audits, and developing formal controls while still remaining, unfortunately, operationally vulnerable. So I think it's really arguing this whole pillar about cyber defense being measured by actual resilience and not just a tick the box exercise. And what happens for a lot of regulated institutions is we have to, unfortunately, navigate a myriad of regulations around cyber resilience, cybersecurity, and we develop these beautiful manuals that look amazing. They pass muster from a regulatory perspective, but they are not practical. They don't really test what would happen in a real life situation. And I can tell you firsthand that I have seen circumstances where the Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, has been very critical of firms, for example, when they develop their business continuity plans, where it looks great, but it didn't work in reality when a real life cyber attack may have happened. To give another example, in 2017, when Equifax had its breach, from an operational perspective, I should say from a technical compliance perspective, its regulatory framework was on par. But despite having this beautiful framework in place, the company ended up, unfortunately, compromising the personal information of over 140 million Americans, right? And this breach had occurred simply because of exposure to a vulnerability in an unpatched system. So how do you document for that? Sure, you can test, but your plan can't contemplate everything. I want to give another example that we all probably experienced as well, and that was most recently with CrowdStrike, right? I don't think any of us even knew what a CrowdStrike was until you had major airlines and other sectors just suddenly being disrupted for anybody who operated on Microsoft Office. So despite sometimes having these perfect plans in place, at the end of the day, we're still susceptible to certain vulnerabilities. And I think that is what this pillar is getting at. Don't fixate on investing resources into these compliance sort of tick the box sort of exercises. Make sure that you are actually building and protecting yourselves from real intrusions and you are resilient. And to go to your question around the NIST framework, I don't know, because it's not clear what frameworks it's criticizing. It could very well be criticizing aspects of the NIST framework. In my personal view, I find that the NIST framework is pretty flexible when you think about the myriad of regulations that exist globally, and you can actually put many of those into the general framework. But if I were to be a little pessimistic, and you can't see Alex maybe nodding his head here, I think when Alex referenced earlier, some of the challenges in trying to develop these partnerships, my guess is that it would be a little bit of a dig at the NIST framework and fixating less on the kinds of assessments you need to do under it, and instead refocusing your resources on the private side, state side, et cetera, for anyone who has to adhere to these frameworks into things that you can invest in things that make you a little more operational resilient.
Today's podcast is brought to you by one of the over 150 City Bar committees. If you're a City Bar member and want to become involved with work like this, with creating programming on cutting-edge topics, with shaping public policy, or to build relationships with professionals in your practice area, join a committee today by logging into your City Bar account at nycbar.org and clicking Join a Committee.
So Alex, Sabeena is throwing the gauntlet over to you with a challenge. So I'm going to give you a challenge. Within this common sense regulation discussion, I, for all of my practice, have struggled with the concept of, quote, streamlining regulations to reduce compliance burden, address liability, and better align, in this particular case, the regulators and the industry globally. So take on that challenge. What exactly does this plan have in mind? What are some of the sorts of regulations that exist where you can streamline them and reduce compliance burdens, address liability? Then this is the challenge. How do you better align them? Because we have cybersecurity laws and regulations at the state and in some cases local level. You have them at the federal level. All of these reporting requirements. If you're a regulated institution like Sabeena's organization, you have a myriad of regulatory agencies, each requiring you to respond and provide notice and keep them informed on any possible intrusion or cyber incident, I would call it. And then the challenge is to take all of these regulations at the state level, at the federal level, and presumably internationally, and have them better align with the global industry. Quite frankly, Alex, a lot of the global industry isn't aligned. So help me with this one.
To be blunt, this one doesn't fit. To me, this pillar is about an overall administration efforts to deregulate generally, which is a top priority of the administration, and some might say is long overdue, and some might say goes too far. But it doesn't really fit a cybersecurity strategy, to be blunt. And I mean, NIST is not generally, it's not required by any federal law. There are places where it effectively becomes required under certain circumstances. The agency, CISA, which is the overarching agency focused on cybersecurity, has done a wonderful job of aligning with industry. And to be blunt, this administration has somewhat deprioritized the role of CISA and removed a lot of top talent. So I think that this pillar is really much more about other regulators, and I think other regulations. And I think when they talk about better aligned regulators with industry globally, the comment is a little bit orthogonal to the strategy here, which is to say it's about deregulation, right? So the SEC had certain requirements about cybersecurity, and so they're sort of deprioritizing, taking that, pulling that back. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is doing lots of activity which is not really cybersecurity related at all, although a little bit would touch on it. And there was a view that they went too far in enforcement. We see this in the crypto industry, which has become very much sort of hands-off regulatorily. So I think, to be frank, this is about a lot of these other issues, and it raises a whole host of other questions. And look, maybe we'll get some clarity if there's an implementation plan. But when they say streamline cybersecurity regulations to address liability, like, what does that mean? There's an ongoing conversation about imposing more liability for technology companies who are putting out software that had holes, or there could be immunizing companies from liability for doing offensive cyber activity. So I'm not sure what address liability means. It's an odd word choice that doesn't actually give one very much insight into the purpose. So I sort of think of this pillar 2 as not really core to cybersecurity strategy.
So Sabeena, I want to give you a challenge as well. And that is, since I've been practicing, it seems to me that when the federal government pulls back, many of the states fill that gap. So if the strategy and this is the federal government's strategy, if the strategy is to streamline these regulations to reduce compliance burden, address liability, and better align. New York, for example, where the three of us practice, New York is very, very aggressive in the cyber area. One of the leaders, if not the leaders, at the state level. So I at least can't imagine New York pulling back. So how do you reconcile the president's strategy of wanting to have this alignment with the possibility of some of the states saying, hey, wait a second, you're going in the wrong direction with this? How do you reconcile that?
I think it's a utopia that'll never be realized during this presidency. But at the same time, obviously it's a goal. We've seen this in the AI space, for example, in the executive orders around, I don't want to use the word preempting state regulation, but also outright sort of, I don't call hostility, but outright criticism, if I could say that, of the state and some of their actions in the AI space. And some states, I won't mention too many of them because there's a lot to talk about in this podcast, but imposing a lot more stricter requirements than what President Trump's administration would like, being very pro-innovation. But what's also interesting about this is that if you read the streamlining language against the very end of this same pillar, it also talks about emphasizing the right for privacy, the right to privacy for Americans and American data. And it also, so to me, when I start to think about at the same time streamlining some of the regulations and wanting to protect privacy, I wonder whether the states who have been obviously very active in this space from a privacy perspective really at the end of the day would have a role, or whether or not he's thinking about national privacy legislation. Probably not. But maybe that's one particular way of looking at it. Just given how strong the state lobby is, I highly doubt it. And I don't see that coming into fruition again during this administration because there'd be a lot of litigation. You mentioned, for example, in New York, you have not only the state regulators that have, for example, adopted things like the SHIELD Act, you also have the banking regulators that have adopted really, really strict, almost industry setting standards around cybersecurity regulations. So how does that fit in? So similar to Alex, it's a nice goal. It's a goal that, in my view, wouldn't pass muster and wouldn't have any teeth in practice.
Yeah. So, Alex, back to you. The next pillar focuses on the federal government, and it's titled Modernize and Secure Federal Government Networks. This is the pillar, in my view, where if the focus is on the federal government, this is where I believe the president can have the most impact because he's in charge of the federal government. This one, Alex, what are the opportunities or challenges related to accelerating the modernization, defensibility, and resilience of federal information systems by implementing, quote, cybersecurity best practices, post-quantum cryptography, zero trust architect, and cloud transition? Again, this is a situation where the focus appears to be on the federal government, and assuming that the president has the money to allocate to this, is this a more practical and less aspirational pillar?
Yes, it is. It's more fitting with cybersecurity strategy from the federal government, which is to say the executive branch has authority over federal government networks. And it's long been a core principle of that to secure the federal systems, which operate lots of critical infrastructure, house lots of sensitive and critical data, and are real targets of our adversaries. And so this is a more classic, I would say, goal, and one that the federal government has long focused on and frankly has done great work at doing, but it's a constantly evolving effort to defend against constantly evolving attacks. So it's a little unclear because, again, we don't see any specifics of what actually modernizing, resiliency, those are all sort of good aspirational buzzwords and part of what has long happened. What's more notable to me, I think, is the items that are called out, which are a little bit of a mishmash here, right? Implementing cybersecurity best practice, that's pretty standard. Post-quantum cryptography, that's actually a critical issue. With the rise of quantum technology, there's a real risk that will undermine the strength of currently used cryptographic methods, both in the government sector and the private sector. And so that is actually a really high priority for the intelligence communities and those who are active in the space. But it's a little bit out of the ordinary in terms of this kind of a list. Zero trust architecture, of course, is a sort of core premise to strong cyber defenses. And cloud transition is a little bit of a non sequitur. It's a little unclear what that is focused on, other than the importance of good security as both the federal government, well, and here specifically the federal government, moves to cloud technology, which they have already done. And so it's a little unclear what that means. Also, just to call out the emphasis on the importance of cyber in government leadership. Sure, that's a good aspirational goal, but then they also add "and in the boardroom," which is an odd addition because it doesn't actually fit securing federal government networks. And that may be a priority. It was a priority of the SEC under the prior administration, which has gotten pulled back in terms of being prescriptive in that regard. So, I mean, overall, Jerome, I would say this is a more standard goal and a laudable goal of modernizing and securing federal networks. And really, again, it raises questions, which perhaps and hopefully will be addressed in implementation plans to see exactly what's meant by it.
Yeah. So, Sabeena, when you were speaking, you actually made an analogy to artificial intelligence. And lo and behold, in this particular pillar, there's a discussion about using AI powered cybersecurity solutions to defend federal networks and deter intrusions at scale. And I guess all of us are pro artificial intelligence, responsible artificial intelligence in particular. But I'm not sure that we're there yet in the technology and as a country where we can have these AI powered cybersecurity solutions to defend the federal networks and deter intrusions at scale. And I say that because while I am very, very pro AI, the good guys and the bad guys have access to AI. And so when you look at, as Alex was talking about, when we were talking about adversaries, Alex was pointing out that, well, gee, if you know the physical location of an adversary, you can do something. But a lot of intrusions are by individuals or by networks that have an ability to intrude perhaps weaker systems to get the stronger systems. But the point is, it's not so easy just to locate, identify, and disrupt those networks. So on this one, in light of where we are, what would you say to the industry, for example, about these AI powered cyber solutions to defend the networks and deter intrusions at scale? Because I'm just not seeing it at the federal government. And there's no question in my mind that the private sector is ahead of the federal government when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence. And quite frankly, when it comes to how to deal with cyber incidents, because while the federal government has state actors that might be involved, the private sector is dealing with state actors, it's dealing with individuals, a whole range of groups. Alex pointed out that in some cases, gangs might be involved. In other cases, there may be people who are involved in, as you said, the AML space. So what do you make of this? You know, again, the AI powered cybersecurity solutions, or are we just going to have to wait to see more detail in terms of what they have in mind?
Definitely both are. That's also true. I mean, listen, it's a laudable goal, right? And you see it also underscoring some of the later pillars as well that we'll probably get to. Without a doubt, if the federal government wants to have best in class technology and best in class sort of surveillance systems, AI is critical. How it will be implemented, how they can develop it is a big question mark. You also have to remember in the current administration, there's a lot of cost cutting in terms of staff. And so you're going to need to either have to recruit the intellectual know-how to build those systems internally or partner with third parties who do this as their bread and butter. And Jerome, you alluded to this in your question, right? Without a doubt, there are companies like Microsoft and Google that already deploy AI systems to detect all kinds of nefarious activity across their entire global cloud infrastructure. And these systems that they have developed are capable of analyzing billions of signals a day to identify potential intrusions. How you then deploy something comparable within federal government networks requires really careful governance. And you have to also remember, I was thinking about this issue when I was reading through this pillar. Already within I'm going to again think about it from a financial institution perspective. We have gone through mergers and acquisitions. I spent a lot of time at Bank of New York when it went through a Mellon acquisition and trying to integrate us technologically. We used to have a lot of systems that we would call legacy BNY systems or legacy Mellon systems. Imagine now the federal government, which has been around for decades and decades and decades, longer than some of these companies. Imagine the amount of systems and data that it needs to coordinate. So how do you then get these systems that you probably have to apply enterprise-wide to apply to all of these legacy systems, really archaic ways, even down to the kinds of vendors that you want to onboard? There's a lot of challenges. Just getting procurements for federal government agencies can be very time consuming, may take longer than the administration has, depending on how long they stay in power. So I think there's a lot of challenges. It's a laudable goal, but at the same time, the best way to kind of jumpstart this might be through private public partnerships. And there's going to need to be other changes to kind of streamline things like onboarding for some of these procurements, providing some of the protections that Alex mentioned around liability. It's not to say that it can't happen within the next 2 years and some change. We've already seen some public-private partnerships in the United States. Chain analysis and the work that it's done with the FBI and DOJ is a great case and example. We've seen similar sort of analyses, similar sort of situations as well with other private organizations that have helped to partner with the federal government. So an important goal, a laudable goal, but there's going to need to be incentives, in my view, to allow more public-private relationships.
So Alex, 4 and 5, I'm confused by 4 and I really, really love 5. The problem with 5 is it seems out of place, and we'll get to that. But let's start with 4. I genuinely don't know what is meant by, quote, we must move away from adversary vendors and products, promoting and employing U.S. technologies. Is this a U.S. first step, or what is the strategy getting at here with this secure critical infrastructure? And the answer is to move away from adversary. I don't know what the term adversary means in the context of vendors and products. So is the president saying stop using products that were created outside of the U.S. and just use products that were based on U.S. technologies? Help me out with this one, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, so this is focused on critical infrastructure and reflects a point that we sort of made earlier in our conversation, where we emphasize the public and private partnership, right? The need to have government and private sector working together. And that is what critical infrastructure is all about, and why you can't go it alone. What the point, I think, of this note is ensuring that private sector companies are not using the technologies of our adversaries because of the risk that will inject a foothold or something like this. And right, so this came up a while back in the telecom communication with the ban on Huawei and the use of those technologies in our telecoms system. It also comes up in the use of different microchips and other technologies because of the potential risk of backdoors. And so this is something that the federal government has done for some time. And so I think that's specifically what it is. It's part of an America First, right? The idea of let's have American companies who can build these technologies get the first shot, but it's also about ensuring that the technologies that are made by adversaries and may include problematic code that provide for backdoors, that will be not incorporated into the infrastructure. I will point out two sort of notable inconsistencies here, which is that is a certain very popular social media app that had a lot of these same arguments about it, and that was banned from government devices for the same type of reasons. But then this administration allowed it to keep going. And, in some way might say, without respect to the law that Congress passed and sort of allowed it. And just to point out a current dispute at the time that we're recording this, there is a very active dispute with one of the leading frontier AI companies where the federal government and the military in particular is using that AI technology. To go back to the last one, they are really embracing the use of AI technology to great effect and great assistance in the securing national security and achieving military goals. But at the same time, they, out of a dispute that I'm not necessarily weighing in on, has led to a supply chain risk designation. Supply chain risk designation goes exactly to this point, that there is a risk of adversaries using that technology to undermine our national security by creating backdoors or other ways that they could disrupt our critical infrastructure. So that's what this provision is getting at, and we have seen it appear from time to time. But this administration's approach to it is sometimes inconsistent, and it will remain to be seen how that plays out over time.
Yeah. I was just going to say, when you think about the whole DeepSeek incident as well, and the Chinese artificial intelligence models that it
good other example.
Yeah, just it also is in part about geopolitical, technological competition, so security as well, but outright competition, because you can see that the entire preamble of this also talks about how we were the first. Cybersecurity was born in America. So there's a little bit of national pride underpinning this as well, and wanting the US to really be the epicenter of technological innovation.
Yeah, I'll just finish up with a contradiction as well. I don't know how you take the position that you have a strategy for, quote, galvanizing the role of state, local, tribunal, and territory authorities as a complement to the national cybersecurity efforts, when you are also interested in both deregulation and, in some cases, preemption of some of the state laws that would be designed to protect those particular states on these issues. As I said before, my favorite of these pillars is sustained superiority in critical and emerging technologies. And that's why the three of us are dealing with the task force, because we're working on all of these emerging critical and emerging technologies. But when you read the actual pillar, I'm not sure what this has to do with cyber strategy, because it gets into all the things I care about. It gets into cryptocurrencies and blockchain technologies. It gets into AI, including agentic AI and the like. So on this one, help me or help the audience to tie this one to the cyber strategy.
I mean, I would just say it is like one of the earlier ones. It doesn't actually really fit. It is about American competitiveness and sort of the point that Sabeena was making earlier about supporting America technology, the growth of blockchain and crypto in America, the growth of AI in America. It seems to be much more focused on that. Are there elements of that touch on cybersecurity? Sure. Are those important industries that we need to make sure, are they part of critical infrastructure and we need to make sure they're secure? Yes. But it's not specifically tied. Again, there's a focus on the adoption of post-quantum cryptography and secure quantum computing. That is critically important to our future in a way that I think many don't fully understand. And all of this about supporting these industries, I mean, look, the sustaining superiority brings in perhaps some political element to the aspiration here, but the principle is consistent with this administration's focus on supporting growth of American industries, particularly in these areas. And so my view is really as simple as that.
Sabeena?
Going to add that so critical infrastructure in the United States is not necessarily owned by the federal government. Instead, it's owned by a lot of private companies or local government. And if you look at the examples that they provide here, like they talk about, for example, energy, the energy grid, financial and telecommunication systems, all of these underscore that, right? Like healthcare, for example, is mostly private, but there are some public hospitals. Energy, mostly private companies. Think about Con Ed because we're in New York. Water, local governments. So having said that, cybersecurity, I believe what they're trying to say here requires coordination across multiple levels of government, as well as the private sector. And so what they're trying to do is trying to, I guess, apply a layered sort of governance approach where there is national coordination and threat intelligence being driven from Washington, but it's being combined with sort of local execution preparedness on the ground from the state side of things. And just to give an example, Alex talked about this earlier. We know that CISA, right? It's an information sharing coordinating body. So its role is just an example of where you can see this sort of layered approach. I have to say it does kind of go at odds with the earlier pillars around streamlining cybersecurity governance and regulation, but it is something where you start to see a little bit more of this layered approach. Recognition for some of the critical infrastructure that's being owned and operated both by private sector as well as the states.
Yeah, okay. So our final pillar, I think, is also conceptually, at least to me, easy. And this is one that, in my view, this is an excellent aspiration if you want to get it right in cyberspace area. We cannot get it right without doing what this requires. And so I probably would have put this pillar first. It's aptly titled Build Talent and Capacity. And again, I really think that this one is critically important. What did you guys take? Alex, you want to start? What's your take on this one?
Yeah, agreed. I think it is critically important. I'm actually not sure exactly how it fits, or at least in a national cybersecurity strategy. Like it's sort of a foundational point and it's a worthwhile point, but it's not necessarily as high of a strategic kind of concept. I will note that it also has some intersection with a number of other issues, like the current administration's focus on immigration and immigration reform, right? The idea of building a cyber workforce in America, there are the best and brightest come from around the globe. And at least my personal view is we should encourage technology companies to be able to hire folks from around the globe. And that's not necessarily as high a priority in this current administration. And so, yeah, I think it is an important principle that, again, doesn't quite fit, but remains. And I'll say a quick aside, which is maybe not so much specific to this and wouldn't be raised, but what is perhaps unspoken here is, again, the role of AI, right? Like, how is the role of AI going to interplay with a workforce and jobs? I think it can be a booster and an accelerator, but I do think there's going to be some employment dislocation related to that. And again, that also is not really a topic for a cybersecurity strategy, but it would have been interesting to see some comment about that here and to see what the administration's view is on that, because that could potentially lead to economic dislocation, higher unemployment numbers, which, as we know, is not a positive from a political standpoint. So that's really, again, not meant for the cybersecurity strategy, but it just jumped out in my mind, in part perhaps because I have post-college kids and I think about the employment markets specifically and the impact of AI on that.
Just to add, to give a little support to what Alex referenced as well, especially with the language around agentic AI, that would presuppose not a human in the middle. So it's almost, again, at odds. Having said that, I do think that I'm going to take a different view, which is I do think it's, although aspirational, it does fit within the strategy. And although this as a goal is widely supported, I do think, for all the reasons that Alex mentioned, implementation is going to be super challenging. You know, the administration wants a pipeline, right? That's pragmatic, it's accessible, but that is ambitious because when you think about the institutions from which you'd have to pull this pipeline, they all operate on different incentives and different timelines, different funding models. They have different definitions of success. And couple that with, for example, the immigration policy changes, it makes it really hard to understand how you're going to build this workforce. And obviously, there's some language around wanting to align, for example, educational curricula and wanting to ensure that our academic institutions become this pipeline, but there's got to be real investment there. You've got to be able to have programs that sort of support this and incentivize this. And all of that just doesn't exist today. And the other thing I should mention too is that if you want to also attract a lot of this talent at the federal government stage, which is where you're going to have a lot of this technology deployed, right, in order to protect the federal government networks, you have this real mismatch between private sector incentivizing a lot of talent to work for it, and that dissuades individuals with other talent from taking on lower paying jobs with the federal government. So it's also not clear how the federal government itself is going to attract this talent and not have that a talent being attracted by the private sector. For all the reasons that Alex mentioned earlier, there's also some real implementation challenges with trying to get the type of public-private coordination that we want, simply because some of the safe harbors that exist that we would like on the private sector in order to incentivize them to really partner with the U.S. government just doesn't exist today.
Yeah, one of the interesting, and we didn't spend a lot of time on it because I didn't want to spend a lot of time on it, but it is somewhat of an elephant in the room, and that is this strategy, to me, is going to be extraordinarily expensive if it's pulled off. And one of the problems with extraordinarily expensive strategies is you need sustained investment over a long, long period of time. And I'm just not sure where the country is today. We're likely to see the sustained investment in this type of strategy over a long period of time. And what I mean by that is I'm saying decades. You don't just pull this off in a year or 2 years. We're talking about what is tantamount to a global strategy. And I'm just not sure how you pull it off.
So
Sure.
in the phrase that Sabeena, you focused on earlier from the shaping adversarial behavior, there's a reference to the allies. I read that to be this issue, which is consistent with how this administration is focused on our allies sharing the cost and responsibility. I agree, Jerome, it's going to be very expensive. And I thought that phrase about cooperation with allies was really allies, you got to pay your fair share, which is consistent with the administration's view, and I think is one way to attack the reality that it is going to be very expensive here. And if you can, in fact, share that, because disrupting adversarial behavior probably inures to the benefit of many sort of industrialized nations, not just the United States. And so it certainly makes sense that there should be some sharing of that. It's complicated and challenging, but I do think, Jerome, back to your core point, this will be very expensive. And I think we'll see if in fact there is an implementation plan, which I hope there is, because I think that would provide more guidance and clarity. We'll see a lot more specifics and we'll understand better what the potential costs could be.
Before I close us out, Sabeena, I'll give you the last word.
So I like Alex's point about cost sharing with some of our allies. The only thing is that I didn't look at it like direct funding. I looked at it as also information sharing. So I think at the end of the day, we're going to have the same implementation challenges. This is a really resource intensive strategy if it is effectively implemented. But I can foresee, and it'll be interesting to see, do a 1-year look back later on in about a year's time. I can foresee parts of this definitely being actioned. So we'll do a little bit of a wait and see as well.
Well, that essentially concludes our analysis of the cyber strategy for America. Thanks, Sabeena and Alex, for addressing these particularly important and quite complex cybersecurity and data protection issues, along with my favorite, addressing even the emerging technology issues that we're all working with today. I'm hoping that market participants and stakeholders enjoyed the program and learned a lot. I certainly did. So we look forward to your participation, Alex and Sabeena, in the next podcast, and the audience to stay tuned for our next podcast hosted by the task force. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the City Bar. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe wherever you listen. Find more City Bar podcasts on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, iHeart, or at our website at www.nycbar.org/podcasts. Be sure to check out This Lawyer's Life, a professional development podcast where we talk with lawyers about seizing opportunities, learning lessons the hard way, and about what makes them tick. And don't miss Building Belonging, a podcast that embraces authentic conversations about DEIB solutions by amplifying the most marginalized voices in the legal industry and exploring spaces others dare not. This podcast was produced and edited by Jalen Martin.